Hi guys, and welcome to the Is It Worth It for the T-34-85M, the Tier 6 Russian Premium Medium Tank. This tank is not available from the tech tree and is only currently available at the time of making this video in the gift shop for a short time, but I have no doubts that Wargaming are going to put it into the gift shop in future. So should this tank become available in future, or you're watching this video on the day it's released and the tank is still available, is it worth the price? So as per usual, we're going to start with the history of the tank, and the T-34-85M does not have a lot of history. In fact, there's very little information available about this tank at all. I'm really starting to suspect that maybe this tank didn't exist ever. But I'll explain that in a moment. Let's take a look at the information provided by Wargaming first of all. Apparently it was produced at factory number 183, and it was a modification of the T-34-85. Now that information is important because doing a little bit of detective work, I was able to use this to deduce that maybe this tank didn't exist. You see, the T-34-85 was designed and put into mass production in 1944, so it came to the World War II late, and this was a modification of that particular tank, so this tank must have been developed around 1944, 1945. It was produced at factory number 183, which is fine, and the rest of the information says, unlike the original vehicle, it had enhanced frontal armor, which is reflected in-game, and reduced rear armor, which is not reflected in-game. In fact, this is incorrect, but we'll just go with what Wargaming are telling us. Apparently the fuel tanks were transferred from the fighting compartment to the rear of the tank, and when the suspension proved faulty, production was halted after just one prototype was built. Okay, so this was apparently a prototype, only one was ever built, and that's the only information Wargaming are providing about this tank. Now, the thing is, when I did a little bit of research, the T-34-85M did exist. And it was a production model, it wasn't a prototype. There were hundreds of them built, and the problem is, not only was it a production model and not a prototype, it was a tank that was built in 1969, based on the original tank from 1944. So the T-34-85M was actually quite a modern tank. The changes from the original tank in 1944 were that the suspension was changed, the drivetrain was changed. It was basically based around a T-54. The fuel tanks were moved to the rear of the tank, but they were moved externally. And it was quite a modern tank. It had even night vision driving equipment. So that obviously is not this tank. This tank is based around the T-34-85 in game, which went into mass production in 1944. I sincerely doubt that the T-34-85M, as it's officially known from 1969, is this tank. So I did a little bit more digging. I was trying to find out what exactly is this tank, because the T-34-85M that it officially exists is not what we have in game. And what I discovered was, well, this is supposedly a modification of the T-34-85, and the T-34-85 was a modification of the T-34. The T-34 was one of the most mass-produced battle tanks in history. It was designed and went into mass production in 1940, and the thing about it was factory 183 built T-34s. In fact, they built a lot of variations of T-34s, and one of those variations was a tank called the T-34M. And the T-34M is in-game. It is the A-43. That was the other production name for the T-34M. If we take a look at the T-34M, apparently it was developed at, surprise, surprise, the same factory, factory number 183, but it was developed in 1941. It was designed to be an upgraded version of the T-34. It had enhanced suspension and enhanced frontal armor. Now, what this doesn't tell you here was that this was only a prototype, only one was ever built, and it was scrapped due to problems with the suspension. So I'm really starting to doubt that the tank, this particular tank, the T-34-85M, even existed. Its history seems to be a mix of the actual history of the T-34M that was developed 3 years before the original T-34-85 and the T-34-85M that was developed 20 or 30 years later in 1969. So yeah, I'm really starting to doubt whether or not this tank existed, but maybe some of you history buffs out there can give me a little bit more information. But that's the only history I could discover, and let's just move on. Now, I'd love to give you a side-by-side comparison of the T-34-85M and the T-34-85 in the garage, but unfortunately I played and sold my T-34-85 quite recently, and I don't have it anymore. And as much as I love you guys, I'm not going to rebuy the tank just to do a side-by-side comparison. So I know looking at numbers and tank compare probably isn't very interesting, so we're just going to fly down through this. We've got the top values on the T-34-85. T-34-85M is in the first column. The two tanks have exactly the same matchmaking, even though this is blank. So the T-34-85M does not have special matchmaking. It will see Tier 8 heavy tanks, and that is a big factor when considering whether or not you want to buy this tank. It doesn't get special matchmaking. It will see exactly the same tanks as the T-34-85 does. It also has exactly the same hit points. It has exactly the same signal range. Its speed is almost identical on paper. That's very important on paper. 53 kilometers an hour compared to 54. The reverse speed is the same. They both weigh about the same. The load limit's about the same. The crew layout is identical. It is the same crew layout. Armor is very similar in a lot of ways. Now, the T-34-85M does have enhanced frontal armor, and it is enhanced. It gets 75 millimeters of frontal armor compared to the 45 millimeters that the T-34-85 gets. So it does get 30 millimeters extra frontal armor. The side armor is the same, and again, according to the in-game stats by Wargaming, it has reduced rear armor, but that's not quite true. It actually has 5 millimeters more rear armor than the in-game T-34-85 has. The turret armor, again, on paper, looks identical. 90 millimeters on the front, 75 on the side, and 52 on the rear. But again, that's not the whole story, because this is the upgraded turret on the T-34-85. If we switch to the stock turret, you'll see that the stock turret has the exact same armor values. So you do have the stock T-34-85 turret on the 85M, and even though it has the same armor values, unfortunately the cheeks beside the gun mantlet on the stock turret are much bigger, and the commander's cupola is a lot bigger. So even though on paper the turret armor is identical between the two tanks, you will find your turret getting penned on the T-34-85M a lot more than you would on the fully upgraded T-34-85. So we'll go back to top values, and we'll come down to some more major differences between the two tanks. Now, I've seen some people say that basically the two tanks are similar, but you have a slightly worse gun. We'll get to the gun in a moment. I would disagree entirely with that. I don't think the two tanks handle or play the same at all. And the reason for that is T-34-85 is a lightly armored, but it's a fast, mobile, and maneuverable Russian medium tank. It's a typical Russian medium tank. Use it for flanking, getting to the sides and rear, and then the penetration on the gun doesn't matter so much. That's a lot more difficult to do in a T-34-85M for a few reasons. The first one is you have less horsepower. You have 100 less horsepower in the engine, and that means your horsepower to weight ratio is a lot worse. So the tank accelerates worse, and because even though on paper it has a faster traverse speed, because it accelerates worse, because it has less engine power, it doesn't actually traverse as quickly as the stats would have you believe. The other big difference, and the hidden stat that affects how this tank plays hugely, is a terrain resistance. The hard, medium, and soft terrain resistance on the tank is absolutely terrible. You can see that compared to the T-34-85. So this is a huge way that Wargaming nerf and buff tanks. They adjust the terrain resistance, and it's a hidden stat. You need to use third-party sites and software to see these stats. But yeah, terrain resistance basically affects how the entire tank handles. Now, because the T-34-85M gets less engine power, it has less horsepower to weight ratio, ratio, and it has much worse ground resistance. That means the tank accelerates worse than the T-34-85 does. It turns worse than the T-34-85 does. It has struggles to reach its top speed a lot more than the T-34-85 does. It struggles on rough ground. It struggles going uphill. The whole tank basically handles a lot worse, down to the fact it has less engine power and much worse terrain resistance. The fire chance on the T-34-85M is also worse at 15% chance of fire, but having said that, I played 32 games in order to get footage for this review, as I normally do when I'm reviewing tanks, and I wasn't set on fire once, so I think you can pretty much ignore that one. The view range is worse. You've only got 350 meters of view range compared to 360 on the T-34-85. The turret traverse is identical. Now, the other major difference between the T-34-85M and the T-34-85, and why I don't think the tanks are similar at all, is the gun. Now, the gun on the T-34-85 is not a fantastic gun. It's a typical mid-tier Russian medium gun, same gun you get on the T-43 and the T-49, I should say. You've only got 144 millimeters of penetration with your standard AP and 194 with your premium ammo. Now that's okay because it's a medium tank. You do have the speed and maneuverability to get to the sides and rear of enemies, so the penetration doesn't matter as much. But it's still not recognized as a great gun, and the fact that the T-34-85M sees exactly the same tanks because it is exactly the same matchmaking, and the gun is a lot worse with regards to its penetration, means it's a lot more tricky to play and does not play exactly the same way as the T-34-85 does. So you only have 126 millimeters of penetration, and even the premium ammo is not as good. You've got 167 millimeters of penetration with your premium APCR. Now, that is okay, but it does mean you need to hit weak spots now and again, and you will find yourself bouncing on a lot of tier 8 heavy tanks. The fact you don't have that much, or you have slightly less alpha damage in addition to less penetration, means the gun is not looking so great. You've only got 160 alpha damage on the T-34-85M compared to 180 on the T-34-85. Also, the shell trajectory is not the same. The shells take a lot longer to reach their targets. The AP, APCR, and HE all have much slower shell trajectory than the T-34-85 does. Because you've got less penetration in addition to slower shell trajectory, means you're going to be missing more shots, even though on paper the DPM is technically better than a fully upgraded T-34-85. It does have a faster rate of fire, it does have a faster reload, but less penetration, less shell velocity, less accuracy by a huge amount, 0.37 accuracy versus 0.42 on the 85M, and your aim time is terrible at 2.5 seconds on a medium tank. It's really not a great gun. It's one of the things that lets the tank down quite a lot when you get it into higher tier games. It's fine for tier 6 games, but in tier 7 and tier 8 games you'll find the gun letting you down again and again and again. Now, normally when I review a tank, and it's based on an in-game version of the tank, I would suggest, and I've done it in the past reviews, that you would get the in-game version of the tank, play that tank, and if you enjoy the playstyle, if you enjoy the tank and could do well in it, go ahead and buy the premium tank. I did it for the Fury. The M4A3E8 Fury is very similar to the in-game EZ8. The two tanks play similarly, and my advice was that if you buy the EZ8 in-game, if you play it well, if you like the tank, you're going to like the Fury. It's advice I also gave for the Chinokai. It's very similar to the in-game Chinu, and if you could grind up to the in-game Chinu, play that tank well and like the tank, then you are probably going to like the Chinokai. That's not advice I'm going to give with the T-34-85M, because as I say, having just looked at the stats, I feel that the tank plays nothing like the in-game T-34-85. You just don't have the speed, you don't have the maneuverability, and you don't have the gun. The two tanks end up playing very differently to each other. But regardless, let's do the usual and compare it against its other tier 6 premium medium competitors. And there are two other tier 6 medium premiums. The first one is the Fury, the American medium, tier 6 medium. and the other one is the PC4 Schalterm, the German Tier 6 Premium Medium. And taking a look straight away, we'll see the hit points. We've got the least hit points. We've got far less well, not far less, but quite a few hit points less than the Fury, and slightly less hit points than the PC4 Schalterm. So 720 hit points, it's definitely the worst of all the tanks, but it's not that much worse. And when you consider that all three of these tanks don't get special matchmaking, they will see Tier 8s, 720 hit points is pretty much about as effective as 750 or 730 hit points are. Tier 8 tanks are going to tear you apart. You'll be one hit or two hit killed by a lot of Tier 8 tanks that you're going to be facing. The weight comes in right in the middle. It's slightly heavier than the Schalterm, slightly lighter than the Fury. The engine power, although not great compared to the T-34-85, is actually pretty comparable to the Fury. Both tanks get 500 horsepower engines. It's significantly better than the Schalterm, which only gets a 300 horsepower engine. Again, on paper, the top speed is quite good, 53 kilometers an hour compared to 42 for the Fury and 48 for the Schalterm. But again, that's only on paper. You're going to struggle to reach 53 kilometers an hour on this tank unless you're going downhill. In fact, of these three tanks, even though on paper the Fury is the slowest, the Fury has absolutely no problems reaching 42 kilometers an hour, and performance-wise, I would say that the Fury on average is faster than the other two tanks, even though on paper it's got the worst top speed. The traverse speed is not bad, 40 degrees per second. Again, on paper, it's worse than the Furies, but it's better than the Schalterms. It fits right in the middle. But again, poor ground resistance on the T-34-85M means the traverse speed is just on paper. It doesn't actually perform as well as it suggests. However, it does have a very good turret traverse speed of 46 degrees per second, which is one of the fastest turret traverses in the game. So that is a big bonus. The armor again comes right in the middle. Again, you'll see people talk about the T-34-85M as the armored T-34-85, and the armor, it does have more armor than the T-34-85, but not by much, especially when you compare it to the Fury. The Fury is not a tank that has any armor, and the armor on the T-34-85, even though it's got more frontal armor, is not that much worse. I mean, it's only 12 millimeters thicker than the Fury gets, and the Fury is not a tank that's known for its armor. And even the PC4S that isn't known for its armor gets more hull armor and much more turret armor. So even though this is considered a armored medium tank, compared to the other two, it's not that much better armored. It's actually worse than the Schalterm, and it's only slightly better than the Fury. So again, armor is nice, but only when you're top tier, and when you consider this tank's going to be facing a lot of tier 8s, I think the armor trade-off for that speed and lack of engine power is quite poor. I don't think the armor is good on the tank unless you're top tier, and tier 8s don't care if you've got 75 millimeters of frontal armor. The view range and the signal range, however, are worse than the other two tanks. The view range is only 350 meters, which when you consider you're going to be facing again tier 8 tanks, 350 meters is actually very poor. You do absolutely have to buff that view range, and it's significantly worse than the Fury or the Schalterm. And the signal range of 525 meters is not great either, and it does mean, unfortunately, that on larger maps you will find yourself losing contact with tanks on the other side of the map. So overall, it's pretty similar to the other two tanks stat-wise. On paper, some ways it looks better, but in performance it's actually a lot closer. And again, on armor-wise, when people call this an armored medium tank, you could see, compared to the other two premium medium tanks, it's not that well armored. I really don't think this tank has great armor, unless you're top tier and get quite lucky. So we've already talked about the gun. Let's look at the gun again very quickly. It's an 85mm. It's got a very good rate of fire, and the alpha damage is not bad at 160. So your DPM does reach over 1800, and it can be buffed with equipment and crew skills. However, that's the good thing. The bad thing is this is a gun that only has 126 millimeters of penetration with its premium, or with its standard AP, and only 167 millimeters of penetration with its premium ammo. And you're going to be shooting KV-4s, you're going to be shooting a lot of heavily armored tanks. Unfortunately, due to the fact that this tank, even though it's a medium, handles more like a light heavy tank, it means that quite often you're going to find yourself in head-to-head situations where the penetration is going to let you down, and I don't think the speed and maneuverability of this tank allows you to get to the sides and rear of enemy tanks as easily as maybe the fully upgraded T-34-85 does. So the penetration is lacking on the gun, and in addition to having poor penetration, the accuracy is not fantastic. So it's not a sniper, it can snipe, but the accuracy is not great. We've already seen the hidden stat, the shell trajectory is very, very slow, and then on top of that, the aim time is not very good either at 2.5 second aiming time. So you can't pop out like you would in most medium tanks, take a snapshot and pop back into cover. Well, you can, but due to the fact you've got slow shell trajectory, due to the fact your accuracy is not good and your aim time is not good, it means that quite often when you pop out to take a shot, those shots are not going to hit. The gun is okay when you're top tier. In fact, it can be quite good when you're top tier with that DPM, but when you are bottom tier, this gun really, really suffers. So let's see this gun and engine in action. We are here on Steps and it's a tier 6 game. Now, as I've been saying, this tank performs really, really well when it gets into tier 6 matchups. In fact, I found it really, really difficult to find good examples of T-34-85M gameplay because so many games were average. The tank is a pretty average tank in my opinion. I don't want to give away too much this early in the review, but I found myself having a lot of average games. Not that great damage, not that many kills, but the tank performed, it made money, and it did okay. But this is pretty much a dream matchup, and look, I'm struggling to reach 40 kilometers an hour. We're looking at the engine speed. I'm supposed to have 53 kilometers an hour top speed, and I'm struggling to reach over 35 kilometers an hour, and this is good ground. This is how bad the ground resistance on the tank affects it. So I just touched 40 kilometers an hour, but I'm supposed to have 53 kilometers an hour top speed. The tank really does perform like a light heavy tank. It doesn't perform like a medium tank at all. The ground resistance really, really kills it. So again, I've just touched 40 kilometers an hour because we're going downhill slightly. It's a 9.5 replay, so a little bit jerky. I do apologize in advance, but I'm going to be quite aggressive because when this tank does get top tier, the armor is okay. And there we go. There's that penetration. I've just bounced on an enemy T-34-85M. But you can see the engine suffers. We've got 7 degrees of gun depression here, so that's okay. But even against tier 6s, sometimes the penetration on the gun will let you down. So you can see bouncing on the cupola. I went for a cupola shot and unfortunately missed and bounced on the gun mantlet. But now there's a KV-1 or KV-85 moving up. But I've got side shots, so get to the side, get to the rear of enemy tanks. The penetration is fine. You can see that huge cupola, and there we go, side of the turret on the KV, or T-34-85 below me, and we bounce again. Now this is where the DPM comes in. Oh, KV-85 decides to do a 360 degree turn on the rocks. So while he's busy readjusting, nope, he's come back. So he's put a shot into me, and there's that armor. Doesn't work against the KV-85, but we track him. And we've got the rate of fire to track him again. And we've got the rate of fire to track him again. So he's stuck now. I'm not sure if he's used his repair kit, but this is where the DPM and rate of fire are very, very good. As long as the tanks below me keep my right-hand side safe, we can just go to work here. Now, there is a TOG 2 moving up, and he's probably going to get a shot into me, but I want to kill this KV-85. So, side armor, TOG has no problems penning me. So, angle, and we bounce the TOG 2. And there you go, there's that 2.5 second aim time. Snapshots, not good in this tank. You really, really do need to aim a lot more carefully. and that shot goes high. So the accuracy is not great, the aim time is not great, but the DPM is very good, providing you can hit and pen enemy tanks. So SU-100 dies before I get a shot in, and I don't have enough penetration to go through the turret on a KV-1. So our Type 58 has been a hero. He's flanked the enemy tanks, and the Type 58 is a medium tank that can flank. Again, I'm advancing and I'm only doing 20 kilometers an hour in the T-34-85M. We do get a shot with that 7 degrees of gun depression into the PZ-SFL. Now I'm moving in on this TOG, trying to save Tanza, who's also in a T-34-85M. And we bounce on the side of a TOG. Get one shot in, someone else takes him out. So I mean, we're up to almost 2,000 damage here, but just the one kill. Unfortunately, I'm not in time to save Tanza, but I do take out the T-34 for kill number 2. Just 2 enemy tanks left on the enemy team. And again, this is where the tank suffers, because the enemy tanks are on the other side of the map, and I'm struggling to get up this hill. This is a medium tank, and I'm doing 12 kilometers an hour to get up the slope. And now we've reached flat ground, but because it's slightly uphill, again, I'm struggling to do anything more than 26 kilometers an hour. So we're finally accelerating. We're going downhill. Our acceleration is starting to kick in, and we're up to 44 kilometers an hour. But even though we're on favorable ground going downhill, we still don't reach a speed above 45 kilometers an hour. So the 53 kilometers an hour top speed for this tank is a complete and utter fiction. The ground resistance for this tank will never ever let you go get that speed unless you happen to fall off a cliff or are going downhill. But yeah, I'm never going to get over here in time. The tank just doesn't have the speed. It plays like a light heavy tank. Its speed and maneuverability is a light heavy tank. But as you can see, we did almost 2k damage, 2 kills in a very early game in the T-34-85M. And when this tank is top tier, it is possible to bounce shots. The gun does let you down a little bit, but you can do damage and you can have good games. Okay, I hear you ask. The tank is okay in a tier 6 game. Alright, the engine may suffer, the accuracy and gun may suffer a little bit, but it's still okay in a tier 6 game. As I say, I had a lot of trouble trying to pick out footage for this review, but this is a game on Malinovka. I'm playing solo this time, and I'm up against a lot of tier 8 tanks, so I really don't have time in the review to show you the whole game, but as you can see, we're struggling again. 30 kilometers an hour on a tank that's supposed to have 53 kilometers an hour top speed. So Borsig is spotted, and we aim fully, and we managed to get a shot in. That was fine. So Sherman Jumbo, and again we have no problems penning the Sherman Jumbo. Gonna try and see if I can get side shots on these guys on the hill, but unfortunately I get spotted, but in return I spot a lot of enemy tanks. But really, this is a game where I just want to show you that the tank can be really frustrating in a tier 8 game. It can be very hard work. It's all about waiting for targets of opportunity. And I've already shown you that the gun or the tank is not that maneuverable. So again, we've just lost the hill, so I'm falling back, and I figure I'm probably going to have to relocate. So there's a snapshot, miss a snapshot on the side of a leva, and I'm finally relocating. Well, I will be as soon as I get a shot into this WZ-111. So he shows me the bottom of his tank, and we managed to get a shot in. So when you aim fully, take your time. The gun's accuracy is okay. I mean, 0.42 is okay. The problem is 0.42 combined with 2.5 second aim time means that it's not a very good tank for taking snapshots with. But we've just lost the hill. So I've been spotted trying to move across, and you can see I'm on favorable ground and I'm still doing just 30 kilometers an hour. So in a medium tank, I would expect to be able to run away from this situation and relocate very quickly. But you can't do that in a T-34-85. So what I've done is I've relocated. I'm planning to get shots in on the enemy heavies, and I've switched to premium ammo. So no idea where that shot went, but I'm just going to play it on normal speed, looking for weak spots on a KV-4, premium ammo. I'm firing at his weak spots, but it's a bounce. Okay, side of a leva, he's slightly angled, but again, bounce. Side of a leva, slightly angled, bounce. Okay, we get one into an IS, but that's just a tier 7 tank. And there's that accuracy. That shot goes absolutely nowhere near the IS. Again, a bounce on an IS, and again I'm aiming at weak spots, and someone else kills him. So KV-4 advancing. I'm still firing premium ammo. But when you're up against tier 8 heavy tanks, this tank, the gun really suffers. So he's giving me a side, and we bounce again. Slightly angled, but it was a side shot. And someone else takes him out. So I've only done 648 damage. The tank is quite frustrating when you get it into tier 8 games. So we'll speed it back up, and we get a leva, go for his lower glacis, and we finally get a kill. And the game is over because we cap out. So let's take a look at the crew. And you have 5 crew members. You have the standard Russian mid-tier medium crew layout. You've got a commander, a gunner, a driver, a radio operator, and a loader. Now that's okay. I mean, I'm saying it's okay. It's actually quite good. But again, the problem this tank has, and it's a minor problem, but it is a problem, is a lot of the higher tier Russian medium tanks from tier 7 up, basically on both lines, only have 4 crew members. So when we take a look at the tier 10 medium tanks, you see 4 crew members. So that's pretty much true after the T-34-85 and up. So you're going to need an extra radio operator for your premium tank, but you are going to be able to train Russian medium crews. So as far as crew training goes, it's actually okay. You will train up your full medium crews in here. As you can see, I've got a brand new KV-13 crew in here, and I've got the old, I told you I sold my T-34-85, I've got my old radio operator from the old T-34-85 in here. So you will need to find an extra radio operator from somewhere, but as a crew trainer, it's actually okay. Moving on to equipment, and the tank does have a few shortfalls that you do need to use equipment to try and get around. But starting at the top, the toolbox, again, as per usual, if you've got a spare equipment slot and you've got a spare toolbox in your depot, then a toolbox is not going to hurt this tank. You will find yourself getting tracked, you will find yourself playing it a little bit more like a fast heavy tank. A toolbox is not a bad equipment choice on the tank, as long as you have a spare equipment slot. So toolbox is viable, but again, I think there are better equipment choices if you can afford them. Filling the tanks with CO2 is a complete and utter waste of time on this tank. As I say, I played 32 games in a row with the T-34-85M in order to do the review, as I normally do with all my review tanks, and I wasn't set on fire once, so you can pretty much ignore that one. Enhanced gun lane drive is something I absolutely do recommend on the tank. You've got 2.5 second aiming time. The aim time will cause you to miss a lot of shots, and unfortunately this tank doesn't have vert stabs, so usually you would go for vert stabs over a gun laying drive, but not in this particular case because vert stabs are not available. So I went for the gun laying drive because the aim time was causing me some problems. Engine durability is not a big issue on this tank. I think there are better pieces of equipment, so you can ignore that one. And coated optics I don't think are viable on the tank either, because even though it's a medium tank, and quite often I would put coated optics on fast medium tanks, I do not class this as a fast medium tank. Coated optics are only going to get you an extra 35 meters of view range, so it would take you up to 385 meters, and in my opinion that's still not good enough when you're facing up against tier 8s as this tank does. So I don't think coated optics are a viable choice, but again, it's up to you as to what you want to do. Because you do get into higher tier games, you do have to play this tank passively more often than not, and as a result I decided to go for binocs over coated optics. That takes my view range up to 443, which is very close to the magical 450 meters you want. So when I'm playing this more passively in Tier 7 and Tier 8 games, binocs are a much better choice for me. I do recommend enhancing the optics one way or the other on the tank. Moving down, this tank does have decent DPM, and I thought a gun rammer was a pretty good choice. Because you do have quite a lot of ammo, you will find yourself missing shots due to the shell trajectory, due to the accuracy, the poor accuracy, due to the poor aim time. So the fact I can put out shots that little bit quicker is a good idea for me, and the fact that this tank can be very good when it's top tier in a tier 6 game means I find that gun rammer is pretty much a good choice on most tanks. I don't think I have very many tanks that don't use a gun rammer. Medium spall liner I think is a waste of time on this tank. RT can one-hit kill you, especially when you get into higher tier games. ISU 152s, most of the tanks firing 122mm are going to two-shot kill you. I really don't think a spall liner is that viable. A wet ammo rack is a possibility on this tank, and I've been playing around with taking off maybe the gun rammer or maybe the gun laying drive in order to put a wet ammo rack on, because I've been having an ammo rack problem in this tank. And yeah, over 32 games I got ammo racked 9 times. Now, a couple of those were twice in one game, but I don't think I have ever reviewed another tank that got ammo racked as much as this one did. Now, I did play a lot of games in the T-34-85M alongside Tonza, and Tonza was playing his T-34-85M as well. I asked him was he having a ammo rack problem, and he was saying he didn't notice one, but then after that point, he started telling me every time he got ammo racked, and he seemed to be getting ammo racked in the tank a lot as well. Now, maybe it's just me, maybe I was just unlucky on the day I was playing all those games for the review, but I think the ammo rack could be quite weak on this tank, but choice is up to you. Moving on, we've got improved vents, which I put on most of my tanks if I can get away with it, but unfortunately I think that the other equipment choices are more viable on this tank. So really it comes down to either a gun rammer or vents, and technically I would prefer to have more DPM than the added improvement vents give me, but again, choice is completely up to you. A camo net, if you don't have a lot of cash and if you don't have a lot of equipment choices, a camo net is viable on this tank because it doesn't get special matchmaking, because you'll be playing the support role more often than not. Maybe if you're working on a budget, binocs and camo net are viable on the tank. I don't use a camo net, I think other pieces of equipment are more important, but there's absolutely no reason why you can't use a camo net on this tank. It is completely up to you. And finally, enhanced suspension I think is a complete and utter waste of money because this tank does not go fast enough. So there are my thoughts on equipment, but as per usual, equipment choices are completely up to you. Okay folks, time for the overview game, a game where I show you as many strengths and weaknesses of whatever tank I'm reviewing in one replay. Now unfortunately, as I say, I had a lot of problem picking footage for this tank because there were lots of replays that showed just the weak points. There were a lot of replays that showed just the strong points. I found it very difficult to find a balanced replay to show off the T-34-85M as regards its strengths and weaknesses in the one game. This is as close as I got, and unfortunately it's another tier 6 game. Now I've already shown you that the tank is pretty good in a tier 6 game, but this one does show off strengths and weaknesses as well as I could find a replay. So you can already see it's hills, and we're struggling. I mean, we were doing 25 kilometers an hour. 25 kilometers an hour, not a chance of getting up the hill in a medium tank, because regardless of what everyone says, this is not a medium tank. It doesn't play like one. Enemy Hellcat had absolutely no problems penning my turret, unfortunately. Lots of Hellcats on the enemy team, but I do have a gun that is able to pen a Hellcat. So there's that snapshot. Missed the Hellcat, hit the rock instead. So even against tier 6s, the armor hasn't held up. I've been penned, but once you aim carefully, you're able to get a kill. So the gun is very situational. So now that we've cleared out the tanks in front of us, I'm going to be moving up the hill, and you can see I'm doing 13 kilometers an hour. You really don't want enemy tanks shooting at you while you're trying to get up a hill in this tank. But what I do have is I've got decent view range, I've got my binocs, and I'm going to move up like I would in most medium tanks to see what enemy tanks are camping spawn. And we've spotted a Stug, so I move back until I think I'm in cover, get one shot in, and unfortunately get spotted. So I'm just poking, taking snapshots, and that shot goes incredibly low. In the meantime, the Stug is able to pen me. I bounce the Stug, and now a Churchill 1 is able to pen me, and he tracks me. So you don't have a lot of hit points, even in a tier 6 game. I've only taken 3 hits, and I'm down to 238 hit points. Nope, scratch that. I'm down to 115 hit points because the tank is so slow, Arty is easily able to hit you. I lost count of the number of games where I died to Arty because you just can't get out of the way fast enough. So again, moving up, I should have dropped off radar, aiming carefully, aiming fully, and when you aim fully, the gun is good. Now I do get spotted again, but I want to kill this Arty, and again, aim fully, get a shot in, and he is running for it, but we take him out. So we're up to 3 kills, 1152 damage. It's a very average game, only 2 tanks left on the enemy team. But even as a tier 6 in a tier 6 game, you don't have a lot of hit points, you still have problems, and lots of tanks have absolutely no problems penning you. So the main reason I picked this replay was the fact that even as top tier, when people call this an armored medium tank, it's not that well armored. Lots and lots of tanks have absolutely no problems penning you. And really, I can't justify the tank having armor that really isn't that effective, and basically sacrificing a lot of speed and a lot of maneuverability in order to get armor that isn't that good. Okay folks, time to sum up. If the T-34-85M is still available in the gift shop at the time you're watching this review, or it appears in the gift shop in future, is it worth it? I'll be perfectly honest and say the tank is not great. It's not a bad tank, but it's not great. And a lot of it isn't actually a problem with the tank itself. It's a problem with some of its stats and the fact it's a tier 6 tank that doesn't get special matchmaking. You see, the hit points, 720, is worse than the other tier 6 premium medium tanks, but not by much. It's pretty average for a tier 6 tank in-game. So 720 hit points is not bad. It's not good, it's not bad, and it suffers from exactly the same problem as any other tier 6 tank with that amount of hit points gets, and that is when you get it into a tier 8 game, lots of tanks are going to be able to one-hit kill you, Arty's going to be able to one-hit kill you, and a lot of tanks at tier 8 are going to be able to two-hit kill you. So the hit points are a positive and they're a negative. It's good for a tier 6 tank, but it's not great for a premium tank. The engine power is technically actually okay. 500 horsepower engine. Compared to other tier 6s across the board, 500 horsepower engine is not bad. But again, compared to all the other tanks across the board at tier 6, including premiums and tanks in-game, 500 horsepower is very average, but the very poor terrain resistance that this tank gets means the top speed is actually closer to about 40 kilometers an hour, and the traverse speed is definitely not 40 degrees per second. So it accelerates poorly, it's sluggish, and it doesn't play like a medium tank or like a Russian medium tank. It plays more like a light heavy tank. Technically, it's actually one of the slowest tier 6 medium tanks in the game, and you gotta remember, it's up against things like the Cromwell. The armor, on paper, a lot of people say it's a positive. It's got 75mm of frontal hull armor, 90mm of frontal turret armor. Yeah, okay, on paper that might be a positive, but you've got to remember there are a lot of tier 5 tanks that have 75mm of frontal armor. A lot of tier 5 premiums that have 75mm of frontal armor. So the armor is not fantastic, even though people say it's a positive for the tank. At 75mm hull and 90 turret armor, that's okay if you're top tier, but so much comes down to the matchmaking for this tank. Against tier 7s, against tier 8s, they don't care about your armor, they are going to penetrate you anyway. And it's not likely you're going to be bouncing very many shots when you get this tank into higher tier games. And in addition, because turret armor is the best armor on the tank, but it's this stock T-35 or T-34-85 turret. That means you've got very, very large turret cheeks that tanks can penetrate very, very easily compared to the fully upgraded turret on the T-34-85. You've also got an extremely large commander's cupola that is a big, big weak spot and that prevents you from going hull down. The fact that this tank has armor and has to sacrifice horsepower and speed and acceleration and terrain resistance as a result isn't a good trade-off in my opinion. I'd much prefer a faster, more mobile tank, especially with its gun. And getting to the gun is not a very good gun. You've got fairly low alpha damage, but you do have a nice rate of fire, but you have very, very poor penetration on the standard AP and the premium. The shell velocity is very, very slow and can cause you to miss shots. The accuracy is poor and the aim time is poor, so it's not a very, very good gun. Now, having said that, I recently reviewed the Matilda 4, and the thing about the Matilda 4 was it's a medium tank, a Russian medium tank that was a good tank with a bad gun. This is another okay tank with a bad gun. But having said that, the gun can still actually do damage. When you get this tank into a tier 8 game, as long as you pick and choose your targets, as long as you're willing to fire some premium ammo, you can still technically do damage. And damage is what equals XP, damage is what equals credits, and this tank will actually make you credits. So even though it's not a very good gun, and it's not a tank you're going to be carrying a lot of games in, it just doesn't have the speed, maneuverability, the gun is not great, but it could have been a lot worse. The view range and signal range is very, very poor on the tank and definitely needs to be buffed. However, it's a decent crew trainer for Russian crews as long as you have an extra radio operator lying around. The tank doesn't play like a typical Russian mid-tier medium tank. It doesn't play like the T-43 or the T-49. It doesn't play like the T-34-85 fully upgraded. It plays a lot more like a light heavy tank, like maybe the IS or the IS-2 speed and mobility wise. At least that's my opinion. The armor is not great. It's fine in a tier 6 game, but it counts for nothing in a tier 8 game. And overall, I think the tank is very, very average. I don't hate the tank, but I don't think it's very, very good. To be honest, the tank was a big, big disappointment for me because I've been waiting for so long for another Russian medium premium tank because the Matilda 4 is not really a viable option due to the fact it's got a terrible gun. So I was looking forward to getting this tank. I was looking forward to it being released. I bought it on the day of release, and I was just disappointed. It's not an exciting tank. I found the tank quite boring to play, to be honest. Top tier, it's okay, but when you get it into a higher tier game, you got to play it a lot more passively, and then you start running into problems with the penetration and accuracy on the gun. So is it worth it? Well, probably yes. It's not a fantastic tank, but it could be a lot worse. And a lot of it comes down to you watching this review. If you are desperate to get your hands on a Russian premium medium crew trainer right now, then yeah, it's probably worth it. Personally, I would wait for the T-55A at tier 8 to be released in the next patch or two, but yeah, I mean, it's not a terrible tank. And even in a tier 8 game, even though it's quite tricky and difficult to play, you can do damage in it, you can earn credits in it, and you can make XP in it. So it's not a terrible tank, but it's not going to be a tank I play very often. And that's the best I can do, folks. It's really up to you. It's a very average tank, and I would rather play a lot of other tier 6 medium or premium tanks than the T-34-85M, but it's definitely not one of the worst. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.